All right. So thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to tell you all about some of the work that we've been doing within the project to think about sort of what's next for Rust. And I want to first say that I gave basically this same talk a week ago with Nico Matsakis, who is not here today, but just wanted to give this out because he and I have been working on this as a code lead together of the team, as well as some other members of the team, which I'll talk about throughout. So Rust has a problem. And you have probably already heard a few times today that Rust turns 10 this year, which is really exciting. But it also means that Rust is getting used, and we have to think beyond adoption, right? So for the last 10 years, it's been easy. When we think about how to design the language and the tooling and the ecosystem, the answer is, does it help? If it helps Rust grow, great. But now we have to think beyond adoption. And if you look at the Rust website, you see our motto, right? A language empowering everyone to build reliable software. And the key two words here are empowering everyone. And the question is really, what does this mean? Who are we empowering, and sort of how? And so coming into this, we had some questions, right? So who is using Rust? What do they love? What do they not like? And really, this Vision Doc experiment is to try to gather this information in a sort of the best way possible. And you might be, if you're a part of the Rust development team, you might say, well, don't we already know what's difficult about Rust, what people like, what people don't? We are Rust users, right? We write Rust every day. But, that's not entirely true. But we do hear from people too, right? So we have this RFCs where people can come and give feedback. We have Zulip that people can come talk about language design. But by a show of hands, who has ever made a comment on a Rust RFC? All right, so I see just a couple hands, right? So if you think about it, we leave out a lot of people when we sort of don't listen to the community. And so that's what the vision work is for. And to do this, right, we use this process called qualitative research. And really, qualitative research is two things, right? There are two things that we have to think about. First is we don't want to introduce biases, right? So if we're talking to an octopus, we don't want to think that they have claws, right? We have to meet people where they are. And then second, we want to talk about experiences, not opinions. So it doesn't necessarily matter if you think of this dress as black and blue or gold and whatever color, right? Because really, your experience is your experience, and we need to listen to what you are. And the formatting here is a little messed up, but really qualitative research has three parts, right? So the first part, we want to gather data, and then we want to make conclusions about that data, and then test those conclusions. And in our work, we're sort of in between the first two. And so what we've done is in the gathering data section, we've done a survey earlier in the year where we sort of got the lay of the land for who uses Rust and in what ways. And then since we've been doing interviews where we sort of dig in and can ask people more distinct questions about their experience. And then we do this process called coding, which is not the coding that you might be thinking of, but rather we take all this data and we try to find themes from it that sort of match what people feel. And then there should be a light bulb here, but then we make some blindingly brilliant insight. So what do we get? So in the survey, we put out earlier March, and we got about 5,500 responses back. So first, we got responses from all around the world. So not just the US and EU, but in Asia, the Americas, Europe, Latam, right? So all across the world. We asked, what language do you use besides Rust? And unsurprisingly, a lot of people use Python and JavaScript, but we also heard from people that use C++, Kotlin, Bash, Java. And we asked, what do people write with Rust, or what other languages? And unsurprisingly, Rust is used in CLIs, but we hear everything from embedded to robotics to networking. And when we look at the surveys, we sort of are missing two groups. So first is, surprisingly, there were not a lot of people that said that they use Go. And so you might draw some conclusions from this, but it's sort of interesting and might be worth digging in further. And then second, maybe unsurprisingly, the people that answered the survey know Rust well. And the people that don't know Rust well didn't really answer our survey. So this is interesting. And to sort of add another layer onto this, we asked, when you gave a survey, if you want to be contacted for an interview. And unsurprisingly, the people who are less familiar with Rust feel like their opinion doesn't matter as much. And didn't say they could contact us, or we could contact them. And so these are two sort of gaps in that analysis. All right, so after the survey, right, like I said, we've done a bunch of interviews. And so far, we've done about 65 total interviews, which on one hand sounds like a lot, but on the other hand, we're trying to find sort of a representative sample of all of Rust users, which is just not going to be possible. But really what we want to find is some set of what people experience. So each interview is about 45 minutes, and it's mostly freeform, right? And then we keep the transcripts and recordings of the interview, but these are just private, and we use them to go back and sort of figure out exactly what people said and what they were saying and how they meant it. And we've done all these interviews, and we're sort of in the winding down phase. So there's a couple more that we might want to do, but at this point, we're starting to draw some conclusions, and I want to share with you all those today. But first, talking a little bit about what an interview is like. So again, thinking back to the qualitative research, we don't want to ask about people's opinions, right? If we asked, what do you like about Rust, we might hear things that people have maybe some preconceived notions, right? And we also don't want to say, what's your favorite thing about Rust? Because maybe somebody had just a really bad experience. So instead, we ask questions like, when the last time you used Rust, what was your experience like? Or, when you first started using Rust, what did you do? And these are very unbiased and sort of experience-based rather than opinion-based. All right, so the interviews. Let's talk about some conclusions. And the first thing is, how do people get started with Rust? So again, formatting's weird, but the first thing that is unsurprising is people get into Rust because it empowers them, right? So for example, maybe somebody used Python before, and they were very curious about sort of the lower level details of language development. And so Rust enables them to get into this. They can write performant code in sort of a safe way. But also, people who use Rust like to talk about Rust, right? So a lot of people said that they heard about Rust from a friend, So, a friend said, I'm a JavaScript developer, but I'm going to try Rust. My friends were talking about it. And, also, what's sort of nice is we're starting to see people use Rust who maybe weren't going to otherwise use it. So people who are using it for work, but not just because they were interested. And once you use Rust, what is it that people like? And you're going to see some things here that you probably already might have heard, right? There's not too much surprising here, but it is nice to see. So first, people love Rust's reliability, right? That whole, if you compile, it works. People find that to be true, right? People love the tools that we make, right? Not just the compiler, but things like cargo Simber checks, things like this that are polished and make the experience a good one. And they love that Rust is versatile. So you can write everything from the low-level utilities, OS development, embedded, all the way up to things that you would initially, traditionally write in Python or JavaScript. Rust can do everything, and people love that. And of course, this is, again, not anything new, right? So Mark from Microsoft talked last week at RustConf, and he put up this slide where he basically said all the same things. People within Microsoft like these things about Rust, and it's the same things we hear. All right, but what are some things that people don't love about Rust, right? So importantly, we're not just here to, think Rust is the best thing ever. We want to hear about the problems. Rust has a learning curve. It's no secret. We know about it, but it's something that we should keep in mind, and it comes up often. One thing we saw very early on in the survey results, and happened sometimes in interviews too, is people said that they tried Rust at one point, and it was too difficult, and so they left. And then they came back and tried Rust again, and it actually works from them that time. And this happens over and over and over. People say, I tried it, it didn't work. I came back later, and it was fine. And sometimes that happens multiple times. They try it, they leave. They try it, they leave. And finally it works for them. But of course, this doesn't always happen. So this was a very interesting quote, right? I tried it and it was difficult. And I stayed difficult no matter how much I've used it. And if you think about it, although a lot of people tried it and came back and used, there's probably a lot more people in this category who tried it and never came back. And technically, right, there's nothing new here that we maybe never thought about. If you think about all the things like lifetimes and ownership and borrowing, PIN, async, these are things that we've heard about, things we know about. But what's interesting is that different groups are struggling with different things. And that was a key thing that we wanted to come out of the SPISsion.org work, is who is struggling with what. There is some hope, though. So a lot of people said that they tried Rust very early on, maybe at release in 1.0, 10 years ago, and they say it's better now. So things like NLL make code easier to write. So we have hope. We are getting better, but we should think about what it is that people need. Of course, what are the things that we can fix? There's some low-hanging fruit. So for example, in the ecosystem, there are a lot of really great crates, right? That is one of Rust's strong points, including, for example, error handling. But in the standard library documentation and the official Rust documentation, we don't talk about specific language or ecosystem crates. And we do this because we don't want to bias people, right? We don't want to, stop development because we recommend one thing. But this does sort of introduce problems because people see the official documentation and they see how to do things one way, and then they go to a crate and they see people using things a different way, and this is confusing. And so maybe there's something we can do here to make this experience better for the users. But there's also sort of the global perspective, right? So outside the US and the EU, Rust adoption is, sometimes a little bit more difficult. But there are things we can do. So for example, we can provide structural assets to different users across the globe. For example, providing meetup equipment so that people can, participate remotely, so speakers can give good presentations to people. Second is translation, right? So all the official Rust documentation is in English, but for a lot of people around the globe, they don't speak English. And so there's efforts like the Rust Español group that are translating the English documentation into Spanish. And things along this line can help a lot. But there's another thing, right? And that's people across the globe have a different perspective in how they enter the Rust ecosystem and interact with the Rust language. So in a lot of places, blockchain is a very big part of Rust, right? Blockchain companies use Rust very often. But people have said a few times that they were trying to do blockchain with Rust, and they were asking for help in some official Rust forum, and people basically turned them away. And instead of saying, answering the question about Rust, they said, you shouldn't use blockchain. And this is not very helpful, right? People are trying to learn Rust, and we're turning them away. Another thing that's interesting is Rust is driven by universities in a lot of ways. But importantly, outside of the US and EU, it's a much bigger deal. So in the US and the EU, there are a lot of other factors that drive Rust adoption, but in other countries, this is not the case. All right, so I've told you a lot of things, but maybe what I haven't told you is some, blindingly brilliant insight. So let me tell you a little bit about this. But to do this, I want to talk about Rust and safety critical. And I want to talk about this because Pete, who is part of the Vision Doc effort, has done a lot of interviews with people in the safety critical field. And he's done a lot of insight into Rust in this domain. But first, what is safety critical? So the premise of safety critical is if you do something wrong, if there's a bug in your code, it might kill you. And of course, there's different levels, right? So if there's a bug in your radio, it might not be a big deal. But if there's a bug in your braking system, it might be. And what we're hearing from the safety critical consortium and people that are doing Rust in safety critical is that Rust is sort of maybe the state of the art. And this means something because part of safety critical work is that you sort of have to give your best effort. And part of that is doing the most state of the art thing. And so what they say is Rust is their state of the art. It's their backup plan. And of course, safety critical is not just one domain. So there's automotive, medical, industry, right? Different fields that are all doing safety critical work. But across all of them, what people are saying is that Rust enables them to be versatile, right? And be reliable. They can write something for their testing and then use it in production. And of course, there are lots of themes that come out of this, right? So like I said, Rust is state of the art. But also things like Rust is an all-around language that I also just talked about. But what's awesome about this type of analysis is that you can actually group these, right? So for example, you can talk about things that are sort of Rust's core values, things that have worked well for Rust in the past and we shouldn't veer away from. Things like allowing less bug-prone code. But there are also some things that, we can do better at. Things where if we do better, Rust may be better for safety critical folks. So things like improving ecosystem crates for safety critical work. And of course, this is not always on the language, right? So the ecosystem work is sort of outside the language development itself, but it's important. All right, so that's the deep dive. So where are we at and sort of what are our next steps? So like I said, we've done a lot of interviews and we're sort of winding down, but there are some more to do, right? So that's the first step, is to do some more interviews. And we've been analyzing data, but we need to analyze more, right? So I gave you some sort of broad ideas and some insights, but we really want to talk about insights across all domains, not just safety critical. And then we want to take those insights and we want to tell people about them. So the original plan was to take all these and make an RFC, but you'll probably hear these in blogs, maybe news articles, anywhere that we can tell you about what we find, we're going to do it. And this is all part of a bigger story. So the past year and a half, the project has been undertaking this process called project goals, where we basically say, okay, here's the work we want to do in the next 6 months. And that helps, but it's sort of a short-term goal. And so the vision doc is part of the work to try to think about the 10 years, right? Where does Rust want to be in 10 years and how do we get there? And to end this out, I want to give you 2 quotes. And the first one is, Rust creates a community of practitioners who stay because Rust enables work they couldn't do effectively before, not just because they like the language. And one of the people that we interviewed said this. And very similarly, all the things, if done, would make me a happy Rust programmer. If not, then I would still be a Rust programmer. And both of these sort of say, people use Rust because it enables them to do the things that they need to do. But we should not just make it a language that they can use and will use, but we should make it a language that people would love to use. Thank you.